So it's time to kick off day 4. Can you believe it? Here we are already at day 4. Yesterday was great, I have to tell you. We had lots of comments on the keynote speaker and the panels. And I got to say, day 4 is a hard act to follow. However, I think we're well poised to do that with an exciting panel on energy resilience in the maritime sector. And then those of you that will be participating in Evergreen, that'll be starting this afternoon. And don't forget tomorrow, day 5, Evergreen will finish, but we'll have student poster presentations in the afternoon and then a wrap-up panel. So I hope that I haven't taken all of what Admiral Parks is going to say, but he's the moderator. He's the master of ceremonies. So Admiral Parks, if you'll jump in and introduce the panel, and off we go to day 4.
Geez, Doctor, you're killing me. I was just hoping you would do my job for me because you do it better than I do. But hey, I have to commend you, Dr. Nickel, for the great job, Dave, you're doing with this. To keep the level of energy and excitement up. Yesterday was a special day, but I'm confident that Dr. Kristen Lewis, who is the Principal Technical Advisor for Energy and Analysis and Sustainability at the Volpe Center, the U.S. Department of Transportation's Volpe Center, is going to lead a great panel on energy resilience. And I'm really excited about that. She got a great panel. I would be remiss if I didn't comment just on one of her panelists is Coast Guard Commander Kate Higgins-Bloom. And she's currently the director of Project Evergreen, and that's one of the initiatives that started way back when in the Coast Guard, and it's an opportunity. It's really kind of I'll say our Coast Guard version of a think tank where we have those innovative ideas. And I remember, the maturation of that process over the years has just been remarkable, and it's great to see that it's folded in with the MRS. I think it's just a great synergy, and I think it's really awesome. As someone who was involved in one of the first Evergreen projects, to see how that far that has come, and this academic collaboration that occurs, for a guy who was always concerned about anything academic, I just really am impressed at how well academia and industry and the government and even nonprofits are working together. And that collaboration is really something to behold. And I want to give you and the rest of the whole MRS team a lot of credit for doing that. So, Doctor, thank you for your work and your leadership, and to the whole MRS team. So I just wanted to say thank you and give that kind of public service announcement. And now I do see that Dr. Kristen Lewis, I believe, from Volpe is with us. I just want to make sure she's here. Dr. Lewis, are you there? You are. Great to see you. And before I turn it over to you, I'll just make a quick comment for the good of the order that you will introduce and take care of that with your panelists, and then the Q&A will be handled as we've done it the previous few days. So I want to say thanks for what you do. The Volpe Center's got a great reputation, and I will turn it over to you to make any opening comments you'd like, ma'am, before we start the video.
Thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I've felt very fortunate to be part of MRS for the last few years, and I'm really excited about the meeting this whole week and the panel today. It's been a pleasure working with this group, and I hope that you'll get a lot of information about it, and really thinking about the future of energy and how we can use the emerging options that we have in the energy realm for the maritime sector to prepare for some of these black swan events. So I'm going to turn it over to the MRS team to get us started with the videos, and I'll return to moderate the Q&A. Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Maritime Risk Symposium session on energy resilience in the maritime sector. For centuries, the maritime sector has supported critical supply chains around the globe. Since the Industrial Revolution, the vast majority of maritime shipping has been undertaken using fossil fuel energy sources. But more recently, the maritime sector has begun exploring energy resilience options, including reintroduction of wind power, as well as alternative fuels and other options in order to address price and supply volatility, as well as environmental challenges. The focus of MRS this year is on resilience to black swan events, and the recent pandemic has really highlighted the criticality of maritime supply chains and the importance of resilience in maintaining flow of goods and people. We're grateful to have with us today experts who are going to talk with us about their vision for energy resilience and energy security in the maritime sector, and the importance of energy resilience in contributing to preparedness for black swan events like the pandemic we're currently experiencing, as well as the challenges and opportunities for investing in energy resilience. Andrew Stevens, Executive Director of the Sustainable Shipping Initiative, brings to bear his broad international background as he leads the secretariat of this multi-stakeholder initiative that seeks to lay out a vision for a truly sustainable industry. Captain Anuj Chopra, Vice President Americas of RightShip, is focused on safety, operational risk, and sustainability of the maritime supply chain, in particular social equity issues. Daniel Gent, Energy and Sustainability Manager of United European Car Carriers, has experience in the fuel supply and purchasing area, and Daniel handles the company's green initiatives and is heading up projects related to new fuels and the fleet's energy mix. And Commander Kate Higgins Bloom with the U.S. Coast Guard is the director of Project Evergreen, the U.S. Coast Guard's strategic foresight initiative. Evergreen's mission is to position the Coast Guard to navigate emerging strategic challenges and meet the demands of a highly dynamic and constantly evolving operating environment. Thank you to all of our speakers for your willingness to share your expertise with us, and thanks to all of you, our audience, for joining us today.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Andrew Stevens, Executive Director of the Sustainable Shipping Initiative, leading a small secretariat, and I'm very pleased to be here at the Maritime Risk Symposium today. So, the Sustainable Shipping Initiative, we're an NGO of leading and like-minded actors, and this is who we are. And you can see several names that you probably recognize across shipping, but also across the charterers sector, banks, NGOs, rating agencies, and others involved in shipyards, and so on. We are, as I said, a set of like-minded and leading actors who are focused very much on the long-term sustainability in the shipping industry and bringing about change through thought leadership and leading the way much of the time on or above and beyond regulation. So being ahead of the game and driving change and shining the light on what is the right thing to do. The current work streams that we have in the SSI is the Ship Recycling Transparency Initiative, the decarbonisation of shipping, which is about very much the low and zero carbon emission fuels for shipping's decarbonisation. And we have a human side initiative, which is currently under development, which is very much focused on the seafarers and is accelerated in terms of our focus due to, of course, the COVID pandemic. Just a little before we go into decarbonisation, the Ship Recycling Transparency Initiative is an independent initiative focused on the end of life of vessels, so very much focused on the responsible dismantling from a social and environmental perspective at the end of the life of ships, which can take 25 to 30 years in operation. And again, you can see some leading names that are very much involved in shining the light on the right things to be doing. They are disclosing their policies, practices, and how they monitor and manage performance of the dismantling for the safety of the people involved and the environment. The decarbonisation of shipping related to, of course, energy resilience. Just a snapshot here very quickly. This is probably known to many of you, but the emissions of transport accounts for 14% of global CO2 emissions, and 90% of world trade moves by sea, linked to deep sea shipping, which we are focusing our attention to in the decarbonisation. 2.5% of global CO2 emissions relates to deep sea shipping. What is shipping doing about decarbonisation? We are under the regulation of the International Maritime Organization, which is a UN agency, and an initial strategy on the reduction of GHG emissions from ships set in April 2018 is to reduce the absolute GHG emissions by at least 50% from a 2008 baseline by 2050. And this, of course, is 2 years ago, and it's a very fast-moving picture. So industry itself is, again, looking at how to adopt low or zero emission fuels over and above and beyond the ambition that's already been set by the regulator. There are many actors in the shipping industry, around 8 to 10,000 in deep sea shipping, and over 50,000 vessels in trade. So it's quite a large picture to regulate, many regional and national rules. So getting together on a strategy and an ambition is quite challenging, and this is due to be reviewed in the near future. In addition to this, there are initiatives that are in the financial area called Poseidon Principles, led by 13 leading banks, which was launched in June 2019. And that is focused on the transparency within the relationships of the banks and their portfolios that are held by shipping companies and operators to disclose their GHG emissions and track this over time and improve. And there are mechanisms within their lending agreements to incentivize or penalize performance. There's also the Getting to Zero Coalition, which was launched at the UN General Assembly last September. It's a partnership between the Global Maritime Forum, Friends of the Ocean Action, and World Economic Forum. And the SSI is proud to be one of 6 knowledge partners within the Fuels and Technologies workstream. There are 4 work streams within this coalition, which is now around 120 members globally. We also participate as a knowledge partner in the Science Based Targets Initiative. And so far in the shipping sector, there are 5 industry actors that are committed to set targets and have recorded those within the initiative. Well, when it comes to the alternative fuels, really where we are is at a very early stage, and there is no silver bullet in the maritime sector for which fuels or fuel will prevail in the long run. Here are some examples: the electrofuels, hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol. However, all of these, whilst being also potential for zero carbon and from renewable energy, all carry safety risks, whether that's in the production, the storage, or the operation. Also, biofuels, which is derived from biomass, may be an attractive option, but of course it comes with this controversy in terms of feedstocks and land use and food for fuel discussions, etc. Liquefied natural gas, LNG, has become prominent recently, but only offers around a 20% reduction in GHG emissions. But there is a movement for some, including some cruise ships, who have recently been adopting LNG as their preferred fuel. And then electricity batteries, although it's been adopted in short sea ferry operations in Norway, of course it's quite a challenge based on current technology in terms of deep sea and long range shipping operations. In 2019, the SSI ran a multi-stakeholder inquiry into biofuels for shipping. And I think in terms of resilience, we touched on the 2 key aspects. Kristen mentioned them earlier, and that is the availability and the sustainability of biofuels for shipping. And I think the sustainability and availability criteria goes for all the options that have been explored. The SSI explored biofuels in the absence of others. Many others in the sector, NGOs, academia, etc., are looking at those hydrogen, ammonia, or methanol, whereas we took up the lead to explore biofuels, run a multi-stakeholder debate over 3 sessions during 2019, one on sustainability, one particularly on availability, and then a webinar crossing both. And we led a Climate Week event in September last year photographs you can see there below. And we published a report on our findings of what we describe as our phase 2 piece of work at COP25 in Madrid in December 2019. Our focus going forwards, as I said, there's no silver bullet. It's not yet clear which has the winning combination, availability, sustainability, and of course commercial viability. So we are carrying on with biofuels in what we call phase 3, which is a deeper dive of sustainability or sustainable biofuels as part of shipping's decarbonisation. And that's very much focused on what is available and what is available for shipping. It's the unanswered questions from our phase 2 work, and I pointed out at the end of our report. The sustainability criteria of then marine fuels for the decarbonisation shipping is our other piece of work, which we have just formed a partnership with Copenhagen Business School Maritime under the Green Shipping Project. And we are exploring, as it says, the sustainability criteria for fuels and defining what that will be to lead to standards being created and certification programs. We will not be setting standards or the certification programs, that's for others. But as an NGO, we are exploring what the criteria should be. And that is very much led by the fuels that are on the table, but in particular by the production pathways, so looking at the source of the production and the methods and consequences of production, which is for the full life cycle, so well to wake, which then obviously includes the supply chain of those fuels as well. For us in shipping, what we clearly see is that shipping cannot do this alone. And there are an array here of those that we already are collaborating. There's many more actors in this space who are working on the endeavor of low or zero emission fuels and energy resilience in shipping for the long term. And of course, there are some options which are explored by some and together to seek out what are transitional fuels and what are the long-term 1, 2, or 3 fuels that will prevail. And that's it from myself. Thank you very much for listening.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of this esteemed panel. At RightShip, we are very ambitious and believe that the maritime industry needs to strive for zero emissions. So with that in mind, we feel really privileged to be part of SSI, Sustainable Shipping Initiative, as mentioned by Andrew. In our own efforts, RightShip's greenhouse gas emission rating offers a strategic marketing mechanism to lift the standard and efficiency of the vessels worldwide. The GHG rating aims to increase transparency in the maritime industry by rating ships according to their energy efficiency, enabling users to make more informed decisions towards a more sustainable future. The GHG rating compares ships' theoretical emissions relative to peer vessels of a similar type and size, using the A through G interpretation, where A is the most efficient vessel, G is the least efficient out of that group. The GHG emission rating is publicly accessible at www.shippingefficiency.org, or an enhanced version is available to our customers and stakeholders via the RightShip vetting platform. What are the key benefits? So increased transparency in the shipping industry. We believe transparency is key, and where each one can see the efficiency of each other's vessels. Assist the maritime industry to transition to a low carbon economy through informed selection of using more efficient vessels. Providing the ability to benchmark and track emissions, doing carbon accounting. Charterers can identify more efficient vessels and reduce their bunker costs, and thus there is an economic advantage to it. Ship owners can benchmark their vessels against peer vessels to demonstrate the benefit of investing in efficiency. Financial institutions can reduce their risk by investing in efficient vessels, ensuring a greater return on investment over the life. We have seen a lot of effort and activity in this space and really pleased by the Poseidon Principles and their members. ports are also part of this equation, where they can incentivize efficient vessels calling their port. Just to give you as an example of a typical fuel saving, say between a B-rated and a F-rated vessel, so B being second from the best and F being second from the bottom. And you'll be surprised to note that the fuel savings can be as much as 25%. So for a Capesize bulk carrier on a voyage, say from Tubarão in Brazil to Qingdao in China, the savings could be as much as $200,000 on a single voyage. So what are the fuel technologies in that area? I thought Andrew covered that amazingly well. And as we don't own and operate vessels, we believe as a company, as a principle, that we need to work towards zero emission vessels. That is the aim. And in addition, like you said, methanol, hydrogen, ammonia, LNG, LPG, even nuclear power cells. There's research happening with micro nuclear power cells as well. Of course, this gets augmented by batteries, solar panels, wind, kite arrangements. At the end of the day, we believe innovation is key while we arrive at the final equation, which will power our vessels of tomorrow, which is not too far away, considering 2030, 2040, or 2050. Meanwhile, as an industry, we should use all available scalable technologies to reduce our emissions. At a service level, we provide tools to the industry to be more efficient and to reduce their carbon footprint. We provide carbon accounting. As a company, we ourselves walk the talk, and we are a carbon neutral company by offsetting all our emissions. End of the day, in today's time, it's measure to manage. If we do not measure our emissions, then how are we going to manage them? We help our customers do carbon accounting and carbon offsetting. Resilience is the key, and sustainability adds to that resilience. At the corporate level, where risk awareness is concerned, especially in recent times, as we say in COVID times, we have seen that the risk appetite of our customers and stakeholders has come down, while their risk awareness has come up. So we help these companies manage their supply chain risks by helping them select the vessel which poses minimum risk to their supply chain. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin, for the introduction and for inviting me to be part of this interesting panel on maritime risk in the face of Black Swan events. I'm glad to be here, albeit virtually. My name is Daniel Gent. I'm the Energy and Sustainability Manager for United European Car Carriers. I'm going to explain in this presentation a little bit about who we are and what we do, how we've responded to Black Swan events in the past, and what we're going to do in the future. So UECC's vision is to be the leading provider of short-sea ro-ro transportation in Europe. That means setting ourselves apart from our competition with our sustainability at the top of the tree, and also the offering that we give to our customers. We need to be a forward-thinking, dynamic organisation, and we achieve that as part of a wider group, which is owned 50%. We go by Wallenius Lines of Sweden and 50% by NYK of Japan. It's a dynamic group which is pushing the boundaries on what's possible in the shipping sector, and it's an exciting place to work. Our fleet is comprised of 16 modern vessels. We have the 8 UECC-owned vessels you see on the left, and also the chartered vessels which are coming from third parties and also from our owners. The flagships of the fleet were the Auto Eco and the Auto Energy, our dual-fuel LNG vessels, which are Class 1A Super Ice class. These vessels carry up to 4,000 vehicles and are operated on our Baltic service from Southampton and Zeebrugge in the English Channel and North Sea up to St. Petersburg in Russia. This is the trading route for the company. Explains a little bit of context about what I will talk about in this talk. The trading area that we have is predominantly Northern Europe, as you can see there. It positions us really well to be at the forefront of sustainability and new technologies, because this tends to be the epicenter of where things are happening in terms of alternative fuels, biofuels and LNG, LBG, and that puts us in a really good position to take advantage. I'm going to talk a little bit now about 3 separate black swan events, how it affected the company and how we respond to it. Since this is, of course, about energy mitigating energy risk, I'm going to talk more about how it affects our company. But of course, the risk to the energy mix of our company is tied into this. So, the Russian financial crisis of 2014-17, it really was kickstarted by the oil price crash in the end of 2014, and of course, the annexation of Crimea and subsequent sanctions resulted in high inflation. Our company is one that transports predominantly new vehicles. Of course, one of the first things which is going to be stopped being purchased by in a country is new vehicles when you have a recession or you have high inflation. So, of course, Russian vehicle imports really dropped off a cliff, as you can see there, from 14 to 15, and the numbers have been really depressed. In that situation, what we have to do as an organisation is find a way to employ our vessels, still have some, still obviously supply those customers which are importing into Russia, but without running at tremendous losses, which would happen if you lose 70% of your cargo overnight. So in this case, we find collaborations with other shipping lines that we can utilise to mitigate the losses that have happened as a result of the crisis. Another one which happened a few years ago was the oil price drop. Again, it's quite Q4 2014. It was a massive impact on a country whose 95% of their budget comes from selling of fossil fuels. So there's a huge trade deficit, and the government of Algeria put some import restrictions on, which had a huge impact on our business. We had this service that you can see here into Mostaganem and Shenzhen in North Africa, basically stopped overnight. Vehicle imports were reduced from 400,000 cars a year to 125,000 cars a year in 2016. In this situation, the only way that we could mitigate the damage to ourselves was to just stop the service entirely and find alternative employment for the vessels, or to idle the vessels or lay them up elsewhere. And finally, we have a more recent one, which was the Turkish currency crisis 2018, really related to the high current account deficit in the Turkish bank accounts. The lira was massively devalued, inflation was high, again, imports were reduced. Now, this was a really difficult black swan event to handle because, of course, the imports were massively reduced, but the ports of Otoport and Yenikoi, which you can see in the bottom right corner of the map there, are big loading ports for us. We take a lot of vehicles that are produced in Turkey into the rest of Europe. And of course, the exports were still happening, but the imports had dried up. So what it meant was we really had a one-way flow coming out of Turkey and not a lot going back in, and we still had to operate the vessels into those areas. And that posed some really great challenges for us. So, talking a little bit about what we have done previously, Andrew touched on some points, and Anuj as well, about forward-thinking ship owners taking steps to clean up their act, to operate more sustainably. There's a few things, I won't go through all of them here, but there's a few things which UETC has done over the past decade in the time that I've been here. I mean, we started recycling our vessels with the Green Passport scheme nearly 10 years before the requirement in 2017. Oily water separator levels are much lower than the legal requirement. We take pride in doing these things, and it's often a thankless task. Actually, you don't necessarily get paid more to do this, but we do it as a matter of principle, and it's something that we believe sets us aside from our competitors. So, my job in the company is, of course, Energy and Sustainability Manager. These are the things that I'm kind of leading at the moment. The top left is the main one, Proud First Movers. What you see there is our vessel Auto Energy receiving LNG by truck in the port of Hanko in Finland. These vessels really changed the way that we receive fuel in the Baltic service. Historically, we would have bunkered the vessels in St. Petersburg with fossil oil, and now what we're seeing is a shift where we actually take LNG in Finland. We've taken LNG in Sweden, and we've also taken it in Zeebrugge. This has been a good diversification, and actually that's one of the key threads I want to put across in this presentation, is that the diversification of the energy mix for our company is going to mitigate the black swan energy risks that you see. I mean, of the previous 3 examples I gave you, 2 of them were heavily linked to crashing the oil prices. And what we're doing as a company is we're trying to move our vessels away from using fossil oil. We're trying to do that well ahead of the IMO's targets as well. As you see by the top right picture here, we're pioneering the use of greener, cleaner fuels. We have one vessel now which operates entirely on biofuel, sustainably sourced biofuel, and that's a really proud achievement that we have. I think it's something which shouldn't be overlooked. But again, it's about reducing our reliance on fossil oil, not only from an emissions perspective, but also from the risk perspective of the supply risk of a geopolitical event. This is a thread, I think, and a point that anybody following this should really take heed. Any of the achievements that we've done as an organisation have come about through collaboration. The LNG vessels, which we started designing in 2014 and delivered in 2017, were built in a tripartite collaboration between the port where the vessel was going to operate. We had to get approvals to run the vessels there, and by the supplier that was going to supply the LNG to the vessels, and by ourselves, who were obviously committing a significant amount of money into building new ships in a sector that hadn't seen ships of this size fueled with LNG before. And this on the screen now is another example of this collaboration, which is where the biofuel, which we take from the company Good Fuels in the Netherlands, we decided we were going to start using this fuel way back in March. Irrespective of customer support, we took the view that we wanted to make the step to using carbon neutral fuel, operate the vessel carbon neutrally, 0 carbon emissions tank to wake, about an 85% reduction well to wake emissions reduction between marine gas oil and the biofuel that we use. And you know, the idea that we had was that we would commit to this, and hopefully the customers would follow. And I was really happy that 3 months later, BMW signed up to support the project, offer financial support into the project, to actually transport their cargo on board these vessels carbon neutrally. And that was done so via the Good Shipping program, which belongs to the same group as Good Fuels, our supplier. So it was a fantastic example of 3 organisations coming together to make a real lasting impact. And I'm happy to say as well that the Autosky continues to run on biofuel, and fossil fuel will hopefully be a thing of the past on that vessel. This explains what we've done to reduce our fossil oil use over the last 5 years. In 2016, close to 100% of our fuel was derived of fossil oil. We had a small amount of LNG, which was used that year, and progressively, year by year, we've reduced the dependency on fossil oil year after year. Next year, we have a really exciting development. We have 3 vessels being delivered, which are LNG dual fuel, but they also have a battery on board, so the battery hybrid solution. This is going to further reduce our reliance on fossil oil. And I'll just show you on this slide here, the alternative fuel use. You can see that increase in use in LNG and also in biofuel. And I think Andrew made a good point earlier on, which was that LNG has its limitations. At the end of the day, it's still a fossil fuel. We know that it is a fossil gas, sorry, and we can't get away from that. But what we see LNG as is it has immediate emission reduction impact versus fossil oil. But we also have a good potential to put other types of gas into the vessels. So we can use liquefied biogas. As we've introduced biofuel oil, we're going to look to bring in biogas into our fuel mix, hopefully in the next year. But again, this is something that really needs support from other stakeholders in the chain, such as our customers. This is our LNG battery hybrid vessel. Like I say, due to be delivered next year. We have 3 arriving into the fleet. They're quite impressive. At least they look at on paper so far. They always look more impressive when you see them in the flesh. But this is going to be a huge mile marker for our organisation. More than 50% of our owned vessels will operate on LNG dual fuel, 3 of them with batteries. And hopefully by the time that these vessels are delivered, we'll have a good percentage of biogas in our mix as well, which is a really exciting development. Another project we're working on at the moment is looking at hydrogen and how can we possibly introduce hydrogen into the fuel mix. It's extremely difficult to say at the moment. It's really early in the chain. But what I can say is that we have to be the pioneers in this. So we will be one of the first to use hydrogen in our sector, on our vessels. The likelihood is we won't use hydrogen as a fuel itself, but instead use hydrogen. And this is a theory, but we'd use renewable power to produce the hydrogen, and then through a process of methanation using a carbon source, whether that's from captured carbon or biomass carbon, we can then produce a synthetic natural gas for our LNG vessels. It's a really interesting project to be a part of, but it is some way down the line, and that's why I would re-emphasise that we see LNG at the moment as a great bridging fuel to get us to this future. I'm going to finish on one picture as well, which is not actually UECC's. It belongs to our owners, but it's something which they're pioneering just to show that the group has a similar mindset to ourselves. And this is the Ocean Bird. It's a Wallenius joint venture with the Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden and a Swedish consultancy. And the concept is to produce a zero emissions wind-powered vessel. It might seem fanciful, but it's certainly an impressive sight, and it's food for thought. It's something which we should consider as a potential part of the fuel mix. Andrew explained very well at the beginning that there's no single silver bullet for achieving zero carbon shipping. We see a variety of these different solutions coming together to achieve zero carbon shipping, and we're excited to play a major role in being one of the people who makes that happen.
Greetings from Coast Guard headquarters and Project Evergreen. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn about strategic foresight and really its implications for preparing for black swan, or is what we'll call maybe gray duck or pink flamingo type events in the MTS and in the maritime domain, and some tools that actually might help all of us be better prepared for what lies in the future. And really in the context of this panel, when we look at energy resilience and resilience to those events. So I'm going to talk about 3 different things, really. One is just what is foresight and strategic foresight in general, what is Project Evergreen, and then a little bit of the so what on all of that for us. So without further ado, we'll jump into the first thing, which is, what is Evergreen? And we'll talk a little bit more about Project Evergreen, but overall, it's the Coast Guard's Strategic Foresight Initiative. And one of the first questions we get inside the Coast Guard is, what is strategic foresight? And it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So what we put up here is kind of an accepted academic definition, which is, it's really not a product, it's not a thing, it's more like a process or a practice that offers decision makers new perspective. And really pushes us to question our assumptions and really shape a new understanding of what might be possible and what we need to do now to prepare for that. And as we move forward, that's one of the most important things to think about, is there is a difference between foresight and forecasting. And in a really uncertain world, a lot of folks ask, why even bother with foresight? Why are you talking about 20 years from now when we don't even know what's going to happen in 18 months. In the maritime industry in particular, I think strategic foresight and thinking in a long-term way has particular value for a couple of reasons. First of all, our people. So what you see here is the graduating class from the United States Coast Guard Academy from last year, just wrapping up their undergrad. And for the Coast Guard, the next 5 commandants already are out there somewhere in the Coast Guard. So when you think about the maritime industry writ large, the next generation and the generation after that of ships captains, of engineers, they're already out there. And so as leaders, we need to think about how we're going to shape that future for them. And then there's our assets. Pretty much any ship that's brand new today in 20 years will still be in service. And then there's just the shape of the future itself, whether we want to think about it or not. We know that data is going to shape our environment, and in 20 years, there's going to be more of it. And climate change, which I think has been a big topic here and one that's going to continue to be, is no matter which models you look at, our physical environment is going to continue to change, and that's going to continue to require us to change. And then lastly, global competition for resources, whether that's protein or oil or just space or influence, is going to continue to shape the maritime domain and our responsibility to maintain it. So as we kind of get going, like strategic foresight sounds a little bit fuzzy, but what we have up here are just a sample of the agencies and organizations that use strategic foresight and have used it really successfully, whether it was NASA trying to understand what it meant as it transitioned its shuttle program, or Target, for any of us who have walked into Target to buy a bottle of soap and left with $200 worth of stuff. It seems to be working for them. One of the most historic examples, which is not up here, is Dutch Shell, who really pioneered the application of strategic foresight and scenario-based planning specifically to ride out some real highs and lows in the energy industry. And it's a case that I would commend to you where they were the real shining example. They adapted it from a lot of the work that was done by Rand Corporation, as they tried to play out what might happen in the future. And then for all of those short-term thinkers, here's what I tell my boss, at least, is that when we talk about strategic foresight and thinking 10, 20, 30, 40 years ahead, the long-range planning isn't about those future choices, but it's really about the future of your current choices, that we really have the agency to shape the future. So with this in mind, we'll talk a little bit more about what forecasting and foresight is, which is not forecasting. What you have up here are some things on the left, which are forecasts, really useful and valuable tools for a lot of things. And there is some link between forecasting and foresight. But foresight is really about the so what and in the future. So rather than focusing on something like GDP growth in Ukraine next year, foresight specialists would talk about what are the implications of a continued Russian occupation in Ukraine. And so that will help you think about what foresight really is, as opposed to this sort of model of futures. I'm technically a professional futurist. It's a kind of poorly chosen name because we really don't predict the future. We just think about how we might operate in the future. So Project Evergreen, what is the Coast Guard's Project Evergreen? It is our longest running strategic foresight initiative. It's been around for over 20 years, and it runs on a 4-year cycle, really to help the next commandant or the incoming commandant and that commandant leadership team think about setting the strategic direction for the entire Coast Guard. You can see here a page from our latest commandant strategic plan that shows where Evergreen fits for us, which is way to the left in that long-term strategic planning effort. Over time, though, the program has evolved. It used to be one big report every 4 years, but the Coast Guard being a very operational and action-oriented organization, this particular iteration, we've decided to change it because it worked for 15 years. We should definitely change it to make it a little more relevant. So rather than one big report to the commandant every 4 years, we're focusing on providing quarterly foresight projects to other strategic decision makers, generally assistant commandants or deputy commandants who are making choices now, so that these projects don't become shelfware, but really feed into things like the Coast Guard's soon to be released, or maybe already released by the time this panel is being shown, tri-service maritime strategy, and a lot of the work we're doing to transform our workforce. As I said at the end, we're still going to serve the commandant. He's our boss, and he sets the direction for the service. So taking all of those interim products and making one big report and looking for meta trends that we need to address in the long term. And so this is really an example of how you can make foresight, if you're an aspiring foresight professional, make foresight useful to your agency if they're the kind of company or organization like the Coast Guard that's really oriented more towards action than as a culture. So what are the things that we actually use to do Project Evergreen? So there's a ton of strategic foresight tools out there, and I'm happy to have a very long conversation with folks about all the different things you can do. But you'll see here on this list, we talk a lot about scanning and trends and games and design, but scenario-based planning is really the core of Project Evergreen, and I'm just really going to focus on that from here on out. So what is scenario-based planning? So at its heart, it is an opportunity to put groups of people into divergent futures and have them identify key challenges and then develop potential solutions to those challenges. And then you bring everybody back together and say, okay, you over here have in future A, a solution to your challenges, but you know what? That solution also works in futures C and D. So that makes it a robust choice, because not only is it a good investment if the future turns out the way you think it will, it's a good option if the future turns out differently. And this seems obvious, but it's actually not. A lot of planning, both in corporate America and in the military, is based on the idea of a forecasted future or your preferred future. Like this is what victory looks like. Let's plan for that. And the challenge there is, I think if we look over the last 20 years, we can all agree the future doesn't always turn out the way we think it will. And so you run the risk of building a really exquisite or expensive set of tools that only work in one future. Whereas with scenario-based planning, if you test things out and find out that they work in a broad range of futures, you know what? If you're wrong, you've still made investments that are flexible enough to allow your organization to thrive. And considering how unpredictable the future really is, this seems like a good way for organizations like the Coast Guard, and probably like yours, that have limited resources to really make some smart bets. And so the scenarios, that's actually an interesting element of this, which is why do we put people in future scenarios? And really what we're trying to avoid is what you see up here in the cartoon, which is, don't let the shovel salesman predict the weather, is futures over time, and in our experience, have the unique ability to get people out of their fiefdoms and their near-term concerns to really look at bigger problems. If you go into a meeting and say, okay, every single division here needs to come up with a 10% cut, most of the time that conversation very quickly goes to explaining why that 10% cut is the worst thing that could ever happen to you and to the organization. Whereas if you put people in a notional future that's 20 years away, it's a lot easier for them to step back and look at the real equities that are there. The other part of scenario-based planning and putting people specifically in those futures is that it allows for divergent futures. When you're working in an organization where they want to make a forecast and then plan for that, you know what? That forecast becomes the object of a lot of debate and a lot of time and a lot of energy. So rather than try to get everybody to agree, just say, okay, there's 3 or 4 potential futures. Let's look at them. And it gives you the energy and the time to work on the solution side and not necessarily on relitigating what we think the future is going to look like. Here you have one of the other benefits of working in futures, which is that people can be more creative because they feel less threatened. And the other part of it is collaboration. So what you see here is a picture of 2 people not collaborating. They're playing together, and they're both clearly doing a great job building these great towers, but they're not really collaborating. Collaborating is 2 things. One, it's not only building off of other people's ideas, but letting other people build off of yours and maybe improve them. I speak mostly from the military and the engineering side of the house, but a lot of us can be really creative and great at putting out ideas, but we tend to become very protective of them. And And this process helps us let those ideas sort of stand on their own and develop in ways that we may not predict. So lastly, this is sort of where the slideshow ends, but I'm going to keep going on a few more points, is that in strategic foresight in particular, the current practice, the current practice is, there's drivers and trends that are going to shape your future, and you're going to have to adapt to them. But we at Project Evergreen also subscribe to the theory of the pole of the future, which is that we can create our own future if we want to, but we can't do it if we sort of deny reality and just sort of plan for the future that we want. So strategic foresight tools, both through scenario-based planning, where the process of building those scenarios and asking how might we wind up in a future where, entire ports have been abandoned. And then what can we do to avoid that? Or how might we wind up in a future with a thriving maritime workforce? What can we do to make that future happen? Is a much more positive and empowering way of looking at it than a lot of foresight products, which involve, these pretty doom and gloom scenarios, and you're just trying to figure out how to survive. So using these tools to really look at the pole of the future has been incredibly powerful for us. And I think it's incredibly useful in the context of thinking about these black swan events. First of all, scenario-based planning, it lets you really think about those potential black swans in a non-threatening way, and then look at investments, whether it's in energy efficiency or green fuels, to try to either prevent that future from happening or to be as resilient or robust as possible for that potential future. And to really overcome that failure of imagination. And then when it comes to the scenario-based planning side of it, looking at options and opportunities that will be the best investment for your service or your agency or your industry now and into the future. And I look forward to taking your questions.
So I hope the audience will all agree that was a really inspirational and really diverse panel. And I think our panelists did a fantastic job of talking about their diverse efforts to address energy resilience in the maritime sector. As Andrea put in the chat, please do go ahead and either raise your hand or put your question in the chat so that you can ask our distinguished panelists some questions. I'll start us off. I have a question that I'd be happy to hear from any and all of our panelists on, because one of the challenges we're talking about here is this black swan event that we've just all been experiencing for the last 8 months and then some, and expect to continue experiencing. And many of the plans for energy diversification and resilience that we're all talking about were developed or initiated prior to the current pandemic situation. And it has a lot of associated economic and operational disruptions and challenges associated with it. So I'm interested to hear from you all about to what extent you expect this current Black Swan event to lead to changes in these plans. Will it lead to acceleration of these plans for energy diversification, or do you think it will lead to delay in efforts to address climate change and energy diversification and resilience?
Well, I can go first, Kristin, if that's okay. One interesting development that we saw throughout the coronavirus pandemic has been on the UCOME, the used cooking oil methyl ester supply chain in Europe. So, as you're aware, and you've seen in those presentations, biodiesel is gaining traction as an alternative green fuel. But what's really interesting about it is that the supply network for it is really still quite unsophisticated. What actually happens is that a lot of the supply comes from smaller businesses, bars, restaurants, fast food chains. The used cooking oil is collected in small drops of 1, 2, or 3 tons. Sometimes it's kind of put together at a pyrolysis factory and turned into a biodiesel that we can use in the maritime sector. What happened as a result of the coronavirus was really that, first of all, the businesses which were producing this cooking oil, of course, were hit massively by lockdowns in Europe. So the production of the product actually dropped. That of course really affected production. What we also saw as well was that driving miles reduced as people were cut down from traveling to work. People were working from home, so biodiesel demand itself dropped, and we saw that this kind of really fairly unsophisticated supply chain from the traditional biodiesel market to the maritime sector was heavily affected. So it's what we're seeing is that black swan events can have unpredictable effects on the market. And we actually saw that the price of biodiesel, which was skyrocketing at the end of 2019 because of the anti-subsidy duties that the EU was putting in place, actually were completely reversed by first of all, the reduction in demand, and then even the kind of loss of production couldn't affect the demand. But I suppose the point I'm making is that these black swan events can have quite specific impacts on specific parts of the energy sector. And if we look at our general fossil fuel market, what happened was we didn't find a real shortage in fuel. I mean, we found that we could get the fuel that we needed where we needed it. But of course, the price was hugely affected. I mean, the price of oil, Brent dropped massively. WTI, although technicality, obviously went into negative values for a period of time. But what we see is that all of these different solutions are very differently affected according to black swan events.
I was going to add, if we try to step back and look largely at the maritime supply chain, it remained unimpacted. Actually, the maritime supply chain worked very well in this black swan event. Yes, there were changes in demand cycles where instead of buying one box of toilet paper roll, I was buying 3 of them because of that insecurity. And perhaps we need to adapt in that space. So on one side, we showed a lot of resilience. On the other side, yes, there's adaptation and learnings to be done. But I think there's a lot of new innovation happening in the space. I think we have triggered new innovation where we are getting into more adopting sustainability, understanding sustainability, and new ways we work. So I actually have a more positive view on this, that this will spur innovation and change much faster than what we had planned pre this black swan event.
Yeah, I think from what we see is the calling for the innovation is much stronger to overcome such events having negative impacts. And I agree with Daniel and Manoj. There are pockets of supply chain differences occurring, particularly what Daniel described there, and impacts on price, etc. But I think what we also see is a sort of a future thinking. Picking up on what Kate discussed, is that the certainty for investments to be made needs to continue on the path that it was pre-COVID. So where you're looking for sort of global synergy on policy and regulation is essential to those investments around those innovations being made. And there we may see some interruption, ripples coming through in the near future in terms of interfering with that certainty that's needed to progress with those innovations that everybody's keen to make.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with Andrew on the idea of this sort of near-term volatility, but that the trend, going forward, 5 to 10 years, I think there's going to be so much continued downward pressure for decarbonization. So not specifically on the industry, but I think globally people would be expecting leadership and industry to continue to decarbonize. In conjunction with the COVID-19 pandemic, fires in California, fires in Australia, and the sector of other countries do not have pandemic coming as complicated, but they continue to be that imperative. And people generally are going to continue to demand some kind of innovation.
Yeah, we see that.
But
yeah, we see exactly that from the cargo owners, who of course are representing the consumers, etc. That drive and push is still there, and shipping operators very much feel that. The energy on the industrial side is very strong.
Great. Thank you all for those answers. I'll just reiterate for the audience, feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat if you have questions for our panelists. So I'll ask another question. If we're preparing for these long-term trends, diversification, the idea behind diversification in general is that we're able to deal with a lot of different conditions. And, you guys were just talking about the fact that different, like Dan was saying, that different supply chains responded differently to the current situation. Would you say, are there differences in the strategies we should be taking in terms of preparing for acute events versus long-term events, or are they really the same, fundamentally the same?
I was going to say I really liked Kate's, I think, second last or third last slide where she showed the human brain, and where on one side you're trying to show the old cycle of thoughts and the machine cycle of thoughts, and on the other side you're trying to show the softer skills. And I believe there's no silver bullet. It's going to be a mixture of both of them and how that works it forward. I don't think this has a simple answer. I think it's a hybrid approach which is going to do. One thing I'm certain of is this Black Swan event was a fork in the road, which is going to change the way we do business, change the way we work, change the way we think. And how we adapt to this is what all of us are going to be putting it together.
Yeah, if I may jump in as well, I think the hybrid is probably what we are already seeing. I think Daniel talked to it as well, as hybrid solutions on how vessels are powered. We see the wind propulsion, the Ocean Bird.
Hopefully Andrew will be able to rejoin us and we can hear the end of that. Were there any other comments?
I think, the point I would make is, I suppose, while the Black Swan events can be different, and I think that's one thing that a diversification of the energy mix is going to see, particularly as you saw, like in two of the examples I gave in my presentation were related to oil price crashes and how they affect countries which are massively dependent on a high oil price. Obviously, we're all aware of the geopolitical risk to the oil price and how it affects our everyday spending. We're so dependent on fossil fuels. So a move away from that, obviously, a geopolitical crisis wouldn't have the same effect necessarily on us in 5 years as it would have done 5 years ago, because we'll have a completely different energy mix, maybe dependent on biodiesel or on synthetic gas or whatever. But the thing that is common across all of these Black Swan events that we will come across is that the planning, the foresight required is the same. You have to apply the same principle in the first place, which is you run through scenarios to cover all eventualities. You prepare yourself. You prepare yourself for whatever the situation is. The kind of process that you go through is the same, irrespective of what the specific event is. So there is a commonality between Black Swan events, but of course the actual effects of each event can be quite different.
So I believe we have Andrew back, and Andrew, we lost the tail end of your comments. Did you have anything you wanted to add to your previous comments?
No, I think I was covering there's hybrid strategies that I think is the way forward to secure the risk balancing. Yes. Apologies for dropping that.
Oh, we've all experienced it. Kate, from your perspective on the Evergreen side, how does the Evergreen process work with acute events like that? Are you able to take those into account with the foresight approach?
You can, and I think I'd like to really emphasize what Daniel said about those fundamentals of going through scenarios. Builds a lot of the organizational muscle. So whether you've picked the exact right scenario, there's an Eisenhower quote, which is, plans are useless, planning is essential. Sort of going through that process. So because foresight does tend to look out 20 years or so, or 10, or sometimes 5 now, that seems really far away sometimes. Part of the goal of foresight is actually to decrease the size of the Black Swan and turn it maybe into a gray duck, so such that even some of the biggest black swan events we have, there were folks out there, Cassandra's, sort of predicting them, but also they're really measured by their impact. So the more resilient we are and the more robust our strategies are, if there's a major hiccup, but we respond well, it's actually not considered a black swan. If you consider Hurricane Harvey versus Hurricane Katrina, Harvey was significantly worse in many ways, but is not thought of as a black swan event because the response was so well managed. So when we think about foresight, it's two things. One is building those resilient strategies, as Daniel talked about, over robust strategies, but also trying to minimize the potential.
Thank you. So we do have a question in the chat, and again, for the audience, we'd be really happy to have you ask some more questions. A question from John Hummel. When you consider the potential volatility in fuel sources, such as the impacts noted in biofuels availability from COVID, would the future fleets have to be able to be flexible in terms of what kinds of fuels they can use?
Yeah, I could probably go straight in there as this person who's responsible for procurement for the energy for our fleet. And also it helps me pick up from Andrew's point a minute ago, which is that, we build our vessels now with hybrid solutions in place for exactly this reason. We have LNG dual fuel vessels in service since 2017. As of next year, we start to take delivery of our LNG battery hybrid vessels. But these vessels can run on heavy fuel oil. They can run on marine gas oil. They can run on biodiesel. They can run on LNG. They can run also on synthetic natural gas in the future, as and when that may become prevalent. And also the vessels have battery on board as well. So it enables us to operate in port, as we see in California coming very quickly, the ban on fossil fuels completely in port. So the need of shore power solutions or batteries on board the vessels are, that kind of hybrid solution is the way that you deal with the volatility in specific fuel sources. So you have the flexibility to move between different prices, different fuels, different situations.
I think over the longer term, some sectors, of course, or segments within the industry have a long-term view on ownership of their vessels, whereas many others are operating on turnover of vessels. And there's, as I said, there's no silver bullet, so there's a risk of going down one particular path, which some are seeing in terms of investments made recently. So I think looking for those balanced risk portfolios will be essential for the long-term investment and avoiding stranded asset risk.
Perhaps the only thing to add there is, and I agree with both of you, is that the change in maritime is really being driven by the customer, by these big business houses and charterers, and their policies and their sustainability policies or drive in that space is changing and developing and demanding much more, and asking us to change much more quickly on the blue water, brown water side. So I believe they are in the driver's seat, and they're going to dictate, as customers of shipping, how we adapt, how quickly we adapt in this multi-fuel, multi-energy environment.
Thank you for those answers. I have a question, and this relates to something, Dan, that you brought up in your presentation, but it, I think, has to do really with a lot of the sort of initial investment that we make in transitioning to different types of fuel options. So, Dan, you mentioned LNG is a good bridging fuel to get to deeper decarbonization options. And I know, obviously, we're going to have to adopt something that's available as soon as it's available if we want to start moving things forward. But how do you see those investments as, are those enabling greater opportunities, or do we create barriers by investing in something we know, for example, is a bridging option only, and that we're really trying to get somewhere else?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, first of all, there's the old saying, don't throw away the good because it's not perfect, or don't throw away the good in search of the perfect. I mean, we need to find solutions which are giving incremental gains, rather than sitting on our hands and waiting until the perfect solution's here, because it won't happen. what I would say about specifically our case of investing in LNG is that we see it as a bridging fuel, not only to give you those incremental gains, but it's also future-proof to the fuels that we see coming in the future. And I touched upon it in that presentation. One of the things that I see with our LNG dual fuel vessels doing in the future is using renewably sourced hydrogen, which is produced carbon neutrally, being combined with carbon capture technology. So we take CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, or we take it direct from the source, wherever the CO2 has been produced, and we produce a synthetic green gas. And of course, that ultimately chemically it's the same product as we're getting with the fossil gas. By and large, we talk about a product that's 85-90% methane or whatever it is, and we can utilize that fuel on our existing tonnage with the LNG infrastructure we have in place. So in that specific case, I see it as being fairly future-proof and actually giving you a springboard onto decarbonisation as opposed to creating a barrier. I think there are some technologies which could be seen as acting as somewhat of a barrier. I would look at technologies which are more reactive to specific legislation. Emission abatement technology, we don't have much in our fleet, but I see that as something which is being applied to solve a specific problem, and it doesn't necessarily tackle the longer-term issues, which is why we haven't invested particularly in abatement technology. But certainly for our case, I would say that your investments in bridging fuels can actually provide a springboard towards full decarbonisation in the future.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from the chat from Andrew Tucci. Evergreen seeks robust solutions that apply in multiple scenarios. Do you also look for situations where a strategic choice may not be broadly applicable in many futures, but would be the right choice in a unique but very significant future? Another way to ask is, what is the worst case scenario, even if it looks unlikely? And this is open to all the panelists.
Yes, we do consider that, particularly in the context of national security and emergency response. That's pretty much our business. It's usually anybody's worst day is the day that the chart shows up sometimes. So we do consider it. And there is a lot of creativeness where leadership comes in, and a lot of analysis needs to be applied to really think about the trade-offs between things and that high probability of versus investing in more flexibility. Not necessarily of energy, but when you talk about how you spend your military dollars, you spend it on nuclear deterrence, or you spend it on less exquisite but significantly less expensive assets that can build capacity in developing nations. Those are all trade-offs that are being made resources, so that's the priority setting. But I would definitely look to on their thoughts on that.
Any thoughts from the other panelists?
I was going to say there's no one size which fits all. And I think that's what's highlighted. It's going to be dependent on the trade of the vessel, where it's located, what's the security scenario in that space. Like highlighted, a nuclear power cell would work perhaps very well in a protected environment, but may not be for an open seas, open voyage sort of scenario at this time. And that may change just because of technologies which may come into being and controls which may come into being. So it's more fluid. I think I'd follow what Daniel said, that 80-20 rule. Let's adapt most we can. Let's continue to aspire in that space, but let's not close the door. I would say like having an electric drive on a ship and then decide where that energy source comes to power that electric drive. That's really where I would be putting my money on if I had to.
when we look at kind of future scenarios, potential events, the worst case scenario, the most unlikely event, it might surprise some of the attendees that international shipping, I don't think, is probably as well prepared as you might think for this. I think it's generally quite a reactive industry. I don't think the industry particularly forecasts very well, and this is a general term. Of course, there's specifics from company to company, but it's something that I think certainly has been highlighted. The coronavirus pandemic has highlighted a potential weakness there. We've managed to get through this, as Anu said earlier on, actually, that the fuel supply has remained fairly stable, and we haven't been too affected in some ways, but in other ways, I look at our own fleet, the way that we were affected by this pandemic. We had a significant amount of the fleet was more or less stopped immediately because we just didn't have the cargo to transport. Cars weren't being purchased across Europe. It really was an event that you could say really was actually a worst case scenario. The question here from Andrew is, do you do the modeling for the worst case scenario? And I can tell you we didn't have plans for this situation. What happened instead was we scrambled and we reacted quickly and decisively. I think that's one of the things that we have to see, is that you have to be very decisive in the early stages to prevent hemorrhaging losses in this kind of situation. That's one thing that shipping we've learned over the last few years, particularly with geopolitical crisis and oil price volatility, that we've had to be very adaptive and responsive. But it's something that I think international shipping needs to develop a lot more, is the ability to forecast and prepare itself for these kind of events.
Yeah, and I think. Go ahead, Kate.
Sort of to append on that, there's the call it the pink flamingo, the thing that's scariest that you spend a lot of time thinking and planning for, because it's highly unlikely but very high impact event. But sort of to the point here, sometimes there's just a conversation about acceptable risks, but also what are your real risks? Because in a lot of places, folks do plan for the worst case scenario, but they don't plan for slightly less bad, but significantly more risky. I mean, frankly, when people call the coronavirus pandemic black swan, I think we could point to the last 15 years, public health crises, anything from Zika, SARS, MERS, Ebola, so many near misses, that calling this a black swan is.
Yeah, I'd just add to Daniel's, having been in the industry side of shipping also for many years, this is an extreme event that was probably unlikely to have been forecasted by very many in the industry. And of course, we shouldn't forget that whilst there have been, as Anush touched on, I think the ships have been kept running. The supply chains in the main have generally worked, but they work very much, I think, because of the human intervention to make things happen. And that's despite situations faced, particularly for seafarers who have been centre of attention in this crisis, in terms of, we've seen the reactions, typical survival reactions, national borders being protected, movement of people being stopped. And this has severely impacted, of course, the seafarer movement turnover. So this is one element in terms of joining up the dots and collaboration across national, regional and global actors and players has not been foreseen whatsoever, and is impacting through the roof.
So a follow-up, as a result of the COVID event, have you added new planning procedures as a result of any lessons learned?
Absolutely, 100%. The risk management cycle has become more robust, more formalized, and at the leadership level, it's perhaps a permanent item on the agenda for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely, I'd completely agree with that.
Next question is, what are the unwanted byproducts of the alternative fuels being considered? How are we ensuring that we're not trading one unwanted outcome, CO2 emissions, for another, for example, the need to dispose of batteries?
that's why we say that whenever we are discovering new technologies and trying to adapt to these, we need to do a full discovery of the end-to-end life cycle. Like for oil, we talk about well-to-wake cycle. So for any energy source, we want to look from complete end-to-end before deciding on it. A short-term shotgun approach may not work. It needs to be a full discovery and a full analysis. And perhaps we can help to lay out that framework which is required in that space to take that forward so that it's an informed decision and unknown consequences are minimal, if any.
I think the life cycle assessment is very much to the fore of all actors pushing and pursuing the ideal solution or solutions, and as Anush alluded to earlier, very much the cargo owners and charterers are at the fore in making sure that this is remaining one of the key considerations and not left to be a tank-to-wake discussion, which has been around.
Absolutely, and I think as well what you see is that you've highlighted it there. Us as consumers as well. Ultimately, we're the ones who are driving the shippers here, right? I mean, when I buy a BMW and I make my decision to buy it based on the sustainability criteria, then that's going to shape their decisions in the supply chain and which shipping company they use, right? So what we do, at least for our part, is that when it comes to biofuels, for example, it has to be sourced sustainably. We make sure that there is no palm oil in there. There's no land use change. The product has to have come from a certain radius within the production facility to reduce the emissions. So I think that the onus is on the user and the consumer to make sure that you're making sustainable choices. You're not just jumping into like that shotgun approach that Anush mentioned there. You're not going for a shotgun approach and just saying, look, this ticks the box to solve this problem. And I'm not a scrubber basher. I'm not trying to bash abatement technology here, but of course the issue with emission abatement is that you still have a waste product which you've taken out of going into the air, which is solved one legislation, but then what do you do with the waste? Do you dispose of it to shore? Is it incinerated ashore? Is it neutralized? Is it dumped into the sea? You have to cover all bases here. The same is true of LNG. We've backed LNG, and of course we get the questions about methane slip. And methane as a greenhouse gas, of course, is far more harmful than CO2. There's no escaping that. What we do is we look at how we can mitigate that. You see the engine manufacturers now are reducing methane slip to almost negligible levels on the new engines they've got coming in 2022, 23. We have high pressure dual fuel engines on our existing LNG tonnage, which result in almost zero methane slip. So, you have to be aware of these things. You can't just think it's great, it ticks the box, it reduces CO2, job done, let's move on with our lives. You have to make sensible and informed choices about what you're doing and make sure that you abide by the principles that ultimately the consumers demand from you.
And this is at the heart of the sustainability criteria work that we are embarking on in the SSI. And we're at the first phase of defining this criteria for the alternative or future fuels for marine. And it's by no means without complexity. It's a lot of voices, a lot of issues, and certainly we're learning from the discussions we're engaging in, but the life cycle, whether it's land use or labor and human rights, legality, food security, etc., all these elements form the assessment of sustainability of those fuels and need to be taken into account.
Thank you. So the next question is for Commander Higgins-Bloom. Your presentation on Evergreen noted foresight as a significant key and scenario-based risk considerations as an extremely insightful tool. Since the Coast Guard is in the midst of a total fleet recapitalization, and judging from history, we can expect 40 or even 50-year service life from that fleet. Has Evergreen considered a scenario where marine diesel fuel through ultra-low sulfur diesel oil is not available in 20 years? Thank you.
We have put it into one of our scenarios. It hasn't been met with the enthusiastic results, we'll say. But it is something that, when you're thinking long term, especially when you look at how long the Coast Guard uses the ship, we're just decommissioning something that served us in World War II. So it is something for us to think.
I think just to kind of comment on that question, if I can, I mean, we see that in 2050 for commercial shipping, obviously we have to have reduced our carbon emissions significantly beyond 50% by 2050. I wouldn't be surprised if that was increased. I know that when the IMO was putting forward this industry-wide target, there were actors in the market from IMO, representatives from countries like the Marshall Islands and sort of sovereign island states, which would be massively affected by a rise in global sea levels, who wanted to push for 100% reduction in carbon emissions. So I wouldn't be surprised in the interim period between now and 2050 if we see an increase in that target. I think in 2023 the IMO has a lot of work to do to set forward a roadmap on how we end up in 2050 with 50% or greater emission reduction. And I think in that future, 2050 onwards, fossil fuels will not be part of the energy mix. I mean, I don't see a way that going to the end of this century, fossil fuels can be. I think we need to see that, consumers, again, going back to that point, that consumers are waking up and making decisions now on how their goods are transported. Industry bodies like the IMO are coming together and saying actually that we're going to set an industry-wide target. So yeah, I think from our perspective, we see, to answer that question, have we considered a scenario where marine diesel oil is not available in 20 years? I think, in short, the internal combustion engine is good. I think it works very well. I think it's very versatile and it's a great solution. I think one of the best things about it is it's versatile in the choice of fuel you have. So it might well be that fossil oil is out of the picture in 2050, 2060, and we are still using the same technology, but with new fuels.
And you just mentioned IMO, and IMO has come up a few different times in terms of the requirements that are being put forward. And I was wondering, to what extent do you see those IMO requirements as being driven by industry versus being driven by the states and pushed out to industry?
Yeah, I think the point I made about island nations in the United Nations making a case for carbon emission reductions answers that partly. Really, this is the industry. The industry deals with the legislation that gets passed to it generally, and the legislation comes from member states. I wouldn't say that the industry was asking for a carbon emission reduction particularly, but what I would say is that an interesting thing, at least in our organisation, is that we make our decisions based on our own sustainability agenda. We don't make the decisions for the future based on compliance criteria. Compliance is. It's not a dirty word, but compliance is the law. Compliance is not really, in my opinion, achieving a great deal. You're basically complying with the minimum requirement set. And I think it's incumbent on us, actually, to go beyond that. If you want to be a leader, pioneer in this market, in this industry, you have to go beyond that, actually, and achieve something greater. So I would say that the IMO has done something remarkable, actually, in imposing an industry-wide emissions reduction cap. I think that's a really remarkable thing to do globally across the whole industry. But I think that just to say that we're going to comply with it and isn't enough. I think we need to go beyond that and actually strive for greater as well.
I would go with Daniel's last sentence. The customers of shipping are not looking for minimum compliance. They're looking for beyond compliance. They're looking for best practices. And as much as IMO is trying to get more and more aggressive, and I believe they just concluded a meeting in the last few days, I think industry is demanding more, countries are demanding more, consumers are demanding more. And if we want a global standard, maybe IMO has to be more aggressive, or we will see more likes of regional regimes coming out, like recently proposed by the EU and many of the others, where we'll have a fragmented regulatory structure or requirements. But agree with Daniel completely. It's the consumer who dictates this, and they're the ones who are saying they're not just looking for compliance, they're looking well beyond compliance.
Yeah, I agree with both. The voices that we see and the like-minded and leaded actors within the SSI, etc., are a good example of the growing cross-value chain focus on driving the agenda and not waiting to be driven or reactive, as Daniel said much earlier in this conference, which is typically the history of shipping. It's being reactive, and only when rules change does it change. But that inertia is very different within the last few years, and maintaining it forward now, and very much needed.
Great, thank you. So I do not see any other questions in the chat, and we just have another minute or two. So I just wanted to provide an opportunity for all of you, the panelists, to make any final remarks, if anything else came to mind that you wanted to share quickly before we close our session.
I mean, I'd just like to follow something quickly that Anuj mentioned there, which is a really interesting development. What we've seen is that the IMO has come forward with a global target that we have to adhere to. There is also this kind of localism which is happening, which is a very difficult thing to deal with as a ship owner. You see that you have emissions regulations in the North Sea, Baltic Sea. We've had that for a number of years. The Mediterranean may be added to that. US and Canada has an emission control area. You also have, as I mentioned earlier, California looking at stopping the use of fossil fuels import. So what I would say as an international shipping company is it's actually very difficult sometimes to navigate the localism that's developing as a result of kind of ad hoc solutions almost in different areas. And what we would like to see is, I welcome uniformity. I welcome the idea of a global or industry-wide cap or regulation, which we have to all adhere to, because honestly, it makes your job a lot easier in planning for the future, because you don't have to build a vessel for trading in West Africa, and when you move it to Japan and the Sea of Japan and China, it's completely not in compliance with the regulation. So, uniform regulation is welcomed, and I think we have to go further with that.
If I may add, my view is that I think the word is collaboration today. And that's the only way to go forward. The more fragmented we are, the more difficult we make it to trade and for trade flows to happen. So one takeaway, if I can give, is collaborate. That would be my only takeaway on this.
I echo that. Collaboration, joining up the dots and partnering across the industry and across the boundaries. To make this one industry is essential for those risks that Daniel touched on.
As far as the Project Evergreen, I would definitely agree with collaboration. I mean, really, these are collective actions, and solving them requires a really broad set of leaders. And so I just commend everybody here on this panel and the organizations for being part of that leadership. And really demonstrating the kind of work that they do and taking action on.
Thank you. And I would echo that as well. I feel like this has been a really valuable discussion and really helpful to understand this space and what we're looking ahead at and how, the industry can move forward. So I know I am expressing also thanks from the MRS team to say thank you so much for your participation in this panel and for answering all these questions and for the discussion. It's been truly a pleasure.